Hey, just before we begin, a warning that this episode does include a story that may be triggering for some people. For more information, check the show notes. It's the week ending Saturday the 7th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen panic buying in New York as the spread of the coronavirus continues, Home Secretary Priti Patel accused of bullying in Whitehall, and The Week Unwrapped winning Best Current Affairs Podcast at the Publisher Podcast Awards. Well done us. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, and fresh from the aforementioned award ceremony and therefore not at all hungover, it's Arion McNicoll and James Ashford, and from the week junior, be upstanding for its editor, Felicity Capon. Felicity, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Could this be the week the law went from 50 shades of grey to black and white?
It's when the ring is on your finger that the mask can start to slip, and the promises sound increasingly like threats. It's then that you can spend all day, after 12 or more hours at work, longing to see the person you love, only to find that on the walk or tube journey home, they refuse to speak a single solitary word to you. Eventually, at home, they'll find a way to let you know which particular sin you have apparently committed. Your dress was too short, the top you wore in the chamber was too low cut, or you didn't respond to a message immediately.
That was Rosie Duffield MP memorably describing to Parliament her own experiences of a coercive relationship. That was back in October, Felicity. What's happening this week?
This week, the latest version of the Domestic Abuse Bill will have its first reading in the House of Commons. The bill was among several proposed laws which stalled last year after Boris Johnson decided to prorogue Parliament. Remember that? And the general election was called. So it's back now. And it really is a groundbreaking bill. It's hopefully going to do really wonderful things for tackling down on domestic abuse, which some people have likened to an endemic in this country. It is really serious.
So when you say implications for all our lives regarding this story, you really think this is a game changer? What are the things they are sorting out?
There are very many things, and I won't be able to cover all of them, but I think the first one is that they are going to create a statutory definition of domestic abuse. And I think there's actually a huge amount of misunderstanding about what domestic abuse is. So the government is very, very clear to point out that this isn't just physical abuse, it's also emotional abuse and economic abuse. So economic abuse when someone has sole control of the family income or prevents a victim from claiming welfare benefits. And as Rosie Duffield was talking, it can be picking away at someone's self-esteem or stalking, all that sort of thing. So it's really multifaceted, and I think that's key. And another a key point of it is enabling domestic abuse offenders to be subjected to polygraph testing, which is extremely controversial.
I wonder, James, whether the public are as up to speed with all of this stuff as it seems Parliament is. I mean, they seem to have done a wide-ranging sort of listening exercise, but if you ask members of the public what's domestic abuse, I think you'd get a pretty straightforward description that could really be from the 1960s or 70s. It's when someone slaps about their partner, something like that.
Yeah, I definitely think that people tend to think of domestic violence when you talk about domestic abuse. But as Felicity said, it can often be things like coercive control. And you can see that through kind of partners trying to control victims' finances, stopping them going out. As you say, as we heard in the clip, just people kind of giving someone the cold shoulder and being passive aggressive in that way and making them change their behaviour through being coercive. So I think that it's not necessarily just violence. It's definitely a more kind of quiet, seditious kind of abuse.
Just attach to that the idea of, they're having a bit of a domestic, or it's something that happens behind closed doors and let's not get involved. I think that's the other sort of very antiquated idea that we have of domestic abuse. It's very, very hard for victims to actually speak out and have something done about it. And I think that's what this bill really wants to bring to the fore. But
I guess what I'm getting at is it kind of a victory for women's groups, for victims groups, that this is being discussed? I mean, okay, it was postponed, but this is now coming through as legislation when the general public possibly aren't, as up to speed on this.
I see the point you're making, but I think that a lot of the provisions that are in this bill, and of course it still hasn't gone through, but a lot of the material is stuff that for a lot of people it might come as a surprise that it hasn't been covered off by law already. Things like what Felicity mentioned about accused abusers being able to cross-examine their victims in court. That seems like a shocking thing that's still going on and it needs to be legislated against. Similarly, there's another requirement for councils to provide accommodation for victims and their families, and that I think would also seem strange to a lot of people that victims aren't being given even that basic sort of protection by councils at this moment.
And the other thing that's quite eye-catching is the rough sex defence being... Is it being struck off the books? Explain to us what it is and what they're proposing.
So this is what the government is looking to ban. The Home Office has announced that this could be part of the bill, and this is something that MPs like Harriet Harman have been quite robust about including into the bill. It's the idea that in criminal cases, a barrister, a defence, will use rough sex as a defence and say that it was consensual sexual activity, and as a result, it could lead to a jury or prosecutor lessening the charge against the perpetrator.
So this can even be cases where someone has died and the charge would otherwise be murder.
Yeah.
And they say, no, they were consenting to rough sex and therefore it can't be murder. It has to be one less than that.
Yes, and the infamous case to do with this is the killing of Natalie Connolly by her partner, John Broadhurst. Despite her having 40 separate injuries, including serious internal trauma, a fractured eye socket and bleach on her face, Broadhurst received a sentence of just 3 years and 8 months for manslaughter. So that's the very real result of what can happen if you have managed to persuade someone that it was just rough sex gone wrong. And the more famous recent case is the death of Grace Mullane in New Zealand. The defence tried to argue that it was the accidental result of a sex act that she had herself requested. And the accused lawyer, Ian Brookie, told the jury that the 21-year-old backpacker had died during a perfectly ordinary casual sexual encounter between a young couple. Luckily, the jury didn't believe him and unanimously found him guilty of murder. The Crown prosecutor said, "You can't consent to your own murder." And that's a really key point, actually, because in UK law, consent is never a defence to injury, let alone death. You cannot consent to any kind of injury. And that's actually been established by R.V. Brown, which is a very famous case that anyone who studied law will be familiar with R.V. Brown.
So why strike it off the books then? If it's already the case that consensual activity isn't a defence?
Because I think it's very, very easy to influence a jury that... it was something unfortunate that did go wrong.
But what about when it was? I mean, I realise I'm slightly playing devil's advocate here because a lot of the cases you mentioned there obviously are horrific. But leaving aside cases where a defence has fraudulently claimed or misleadingly claimed that an act was consensual, what about the cases where genuinely there was a consensual sex act gone wrong and someone died? Should that be murder if you take this away?
There was, in the wake of the Grace Mullane trial in New Zealand, there were a few legal experts who came out and made that point exactly. They said we don't need to legislate on this because there's enough protection within the court system already that allows judges to determine whether a piece of evidence should or shouldn't be admissible and whether a line of argument should or should not be allowed. And so they say that we don't actually need to legislate against the opportunity of defence lawyers raising the idea that this is a case of rough sex gone wrong because A, the court can determine that themselves, and B, as in the case of Grace Mullane, often juries just don't buy it. They're just like, that's nonsense. This is obviously not what happened here.
I suppose the point is, James, if sex is so rough that it can potentially end up in someone's death, not to be judge and jury of what people get up to in their own bedrooms consensually, but I mean, that is much further than most people imagine when you talk about rough sex. Most people imagine sort of, the furry handcuffs from Ann Summers.
Exactly, and I think the key is that you can't consent to having serious violence or death inflicted upon you. So that's that key point that, as we say, it is already established in a test case, but it's not in law. So whilst that test case was, it is the basis now that kind of judges and juries look at. Actually, they're trying to. Harriet Harman and Mark Garnier have proposed a move to put that case into statute. So they're kind of basically trying to take that case, but make that the legal basis for future cases.
And I think the other thing that needs to be said is that the porn industry has an awful lot to answer for. I think you see within quite a lot of convicted offenders and murderers, there's a definite correlation between watching really extreme graphic porn that's definitely getting more violent and more misogynistic, and that's influencing. And it is a fine line because, like you said, you don't want to kink shame. What people get up to in their own bedrooms is up to them. But actually, a BBC study from last year found that more than a third of UK women under the age of 40 had experienced unwanted slapping, choking or gagging during consensual sex. And I think there is a real disconnect there, that violence is increasingly entering into so-called consensual sexual activity. And actually, it's putting an awful lot of majority women at risk.
And it's the fact that the algorithms on the free porn tube sites actually push you towards the more extreme content. You know, their homepages feature, you know, stepbrother and stepsister and all this kind of stuff, which previously would have seemed to have been a kink, is now mainstreamed.
Yeah, I looked at some stats from Pornhub, which I'm told is a pornographic website, and searches for BDSM had risen by 527% in the US between 2018 and 2019. So this is something that more and more people are going at like a really rapidly increasing rate, and that's, you know, searching for and seeking out from these porn sites. And I think that people may be getting confused between, as you're saying, the kind of heavy stuff that you might find on those porn sites and the more 50 Shades stuff. I mean, that sold 150 million copies worldwide, so there's definitely some sexual curiosity from a lot of people about BDSM to an extent, but that's very, very, very far away from what's being suggested is happening in these sex games gone wrong.
Yeah, the documentary Hot Girls Wanted, I don't know if anyone's seen it on Netflix, but that is a real eye-opener into the porn industry, and it's a really uncomfortable watch. I mean, that is girls just being abused. It's horrible.
No one ever says when they look at a deep dive into the porn industry that it's a barrel of laughs, do they? There's always darkness there. Yeah. But with this particular act, and like I say, it's sort of difficult to criticise in a way. You know, everything about it seems very virtuous. But I have seen some women's groups, some charities saying it doesn't go far enough. What are the criticisms of it?
I think there's a big question mark over migrant women. I think there's worry that they're not going to get enough protection. I mean, I think these charities will always argue it doesn't go far enough because it's in their interest too, and it remains to be seen how this plays out. I mean, with like the cuts to legal funding and council funding, I mean, it would be all very well to have all these things come into force. Will it happen? It remains to be seen. The other huge one is the polygraph testing, that many people say it's a pseudoscience and it doesn't work, and there is no device that can tell whether someone's lying or not. There's a very good piece on the New Statesman about the problems with that. So I think it is just the fact that it's getting it, giving it more attention. It's a really serious issue. I think that in itself is a good thing. How it plays out, how many women it protects, well, all people of abuse it protects, remains to be seen.
In fact, one of the charities, Women's Aid, said that this could be life-saving, but only if it was accompanied by guaranteed funding for specialist women's services. So I think that's a key thing too, just making sure that those women's services are properly funded. OK. Arion, you're up next after this.
So, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Was this the week that Hugo Boss got bossed?
Well, yes, so I've changed my name by deed poll.
Yeah.
I really didn't expect the reaction that's happened. I didn't expect to be here. I was in the bath about an hour ago.
Well, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
There's the deed poll certificate showing you actually have legally changed your name.
I've legally changed my name, and it's a headache, I've got to tell you. There's so many things you have to do.
Yeah, but it's not about you.
It's not about me.
What do you want Hugo Boss to do or not do?
I would like them to stop doing this, stop sending these cease and desist letters, because no one's confusing these two things. They're not confusing these two brands. Boss Brewing have spent £10,000 in legal fees. They've had to rebrand, they've had to change labels. It's been very expensive for a small business. So I'd like them to give them their money back, really.
That was comedian Hugo Boss talking on the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire programme on Monday. Arion, what the hell's going on?
OK, so the comedian you just heard from used to be known as Joe Lycett, but he is, as you say, now known as Hugo Boss.
By deed poll.
He's changed his name by deed poll. He did that last week. And he did it in protest against the German fashion brand of the same name, which he says, as we were hearing in that clip, has been sending these cease and desist letters to small companies, insisting that they change their name away from names related to Hugo or Boss. And the case that he particularly picked out, as he was mentioning, was the case of this particular brewing company called Boss Brewing, which is a small place in Swansea that has been producing two beers that they got accosted by Hugo Boss about, and they were told that they couldn't produce these beers, and he was so incensed he decided to change his name and start acting as Hugo Boss in all sorts of interesting ways.
Which I guess we can all understand from a kind of David and Goliath Goliath perspective, you're a small brewery in Swansea. No one's going to confuse your craft beer for something made by Hugo Boss. But if you're a lawyer for Hugo Boss and that's your job, and you're aware of a brewery that doesn't just have a beer called Boss Brewing, but I believed actually had one called Boss Black or Black Boss, which is one of the sub-labels of Hugo Boss, specifically exactly the same, wouldn't you be negligent in your own job not to write the letter telling them to stop?
I really like Joe Lycett. I think he's very funny, and this is a very worthy thing to do, and his broad activism on these issues is very good. But on this one, I totally agree with Hugo Boss, actually, the original Hugo Boss, not the new Hugo Boss.
The dead Nazi Hugo Boss.
The dead Nazi Hugo Boss. God, there's a lot there, isn't there?
His company as it exists now.
Yes, the dead Nazi Hugo Boss is a wrong un in general, but on this occasion they might be right. And I think that, because the thing is, I heard that the beer company were actually selling clothing too. So they made their Boss beers, but then they also had clothing which had Boss on and stuff, and Hugo Boss obviously famously sells clothing. So I feel like they've definitely got a justified case here, and it's not so bad to kind of say, maybe you should just change that one or two beer names.
There was a similar case I remember with Bentley, who sued, unsuccessfully as I understand it, a British clothing company called Bentley that had been called Bentley for generations, on the basis that people who sell Bentleys in Bentley showrooms wear Bentley merchandise, and you can technically buy a polo shirt with Bentley on it. That really is pushing some of this corporate stuff too far.
Yeah, and if you look at, say, the Apple versus Apple case, the Apple, obviously the technology company, and then Apple was the company that the Beatles came up with, under which they licensed all their music. And the Beatles company preceded the technology company, and a whole lot of court cases unfolded between the two of them that ended in a big unknown cash settlement. But Apple Computers started as a computer company with no interest in music, and you could see how that could happen. Similarly to your Bentley story, a Bentley car, you could see how it could later on want to transition into creating a clothing label based on the success of its car line, but then it runs into trouble with other brands that might exist in that space.
The thing is, though, Felicity, even if you do understand why these big companies act in this way, you read loads of stories like this that land on your desk in the news. The bottom line is, for a small company, the legal costs are sometimes insurmountable. It costs thousands of pounds to come up against this stuff.
I think it really is a David and Goliath story, and I think, like you say, the costs can be crippling. But I do also think it's something that it is serious. You do have to think about it when with trademark. These big companies will go after you, whether they should or they shouldn't is really beside the point. And you've really got to. There was another one which was, we could probably sit here and list cases until the cows come home. But Starbucks went after Sandbox, which was a famous US case. She was trying to. It was so brazen and so blatant that she was trying to make this coffee and sort of trade off the name Starbucks, and she lost against them. So it's just obviously something that you are a small company, you are going to be extremely vulnerable. You've got to really batten down the hatches and make sure that you're covered on this. Okay,
but we're talking about this story, as always on this show, supposed to have implications for all of us. Has the comedian formerly known as Joe Lycett taking a stand on this changed the way that these companies might behave in the future because of the negative PR that comes on social media?
I think the fact that Hugo Boss was forced to write a very conciliatory, quite polite, a little bit funny reply to Hugo Boss, the comedian, is an indication of the fact that even shining the spotlight on what they're doing has shamed them sufficiently that they're probably going to, well, who knows what they're going to do, but they could be convinced to back off similar cases in the future.
I think it's good from the original Hugo Boss's perspective that they did this really nice, funny PR thing, and I think that will stand in their favour. But I think it's just too big a company. It's not going to. I just don't think this is just water off a duck's back, isn't it?
Well, Hugo Boss promises that he's also doing a stunt, because part of what this is all about is it's promoting his show, which curiously is called Joe Lycett's Got Your Back, which you wonder whether he's going to have to change the title of. It's a Channel 4 show. It's a sort of consumer protection show. But he's doing a stunt on that show next month to do with the fact that he's now got this new name, Hugo Boss. So, we'll see how Hugo Boss, the fashion retailer, responds to that.
And I don't know if you saw this, but I understand a presenter on BBC West Midlands, I believe, has now changed his name to Joe Lycett.
Yep. A chap called Mark Rofe is now known as Joe Lycett, occupying the space left by Hugo Boss in having changed his name.
So I could get a broadcast slot if I change my name to Mark Rofe then?
Absolutely. I mean, you've got a broadcast slot, but go ahead.
I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week.
We're all at it. James, whatever your name is, you're up next after this. Okay, James, you're ending the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Why British naturists are feeling overexposed.
I had really severe body image problems for many, many years. I got really poorly. It left me with scars. I put on a lot of weight and I hated my body. And coming to the naturist environment has given me confidence in myself, confidence in my body. I don't care about the scars and things anymore because I don't even notice that they're there. And for the first time in my life, I'm able to say that I'm happy with my body and I'm happy with the way that I look.
A lady called Emma Stokes speaking on a video for the British Naturism website. James, what is the story that you want to share with us?
Well, the president of the UK's largest naturist group is calling for the abuse of nudists to be classed as a hate crime. So he basically thinks that it's a disgrace that people are getting shouted at for doing nothing other than wandering around with their genitals on display. And in his mind, these deviants deserve the same legal protection as those who are abused on the basis of disability, race, religion, sexual orientation, and transgender identity.
Deviants?
In that they deviate from the normal practice of wearing clothes, yes.
Mm-hmm. So, to get this off the ground, I can tell already that like every sentence I'm formulating in this is going to sound like a synonym for nudity, even if it doesn't ring any bells, like even that. Anyway, to get this off the ground, he would have to prove, or British Naturism would have to prove, that nudism, naturism, whatever you want to call it, is a philosophy. And so to call out someone for practicing their philosophy should be applied in this case.
Yeah, so I think they already claim that it's a philosophical belief. So they're not necessarily trying to say now that it should be defined as a philosophy, that it should become a protected characteristic under the Equality Act 2010, which it isn't at the moment. I listed a few of those characteristics there are. And I just think, I mean, he said things like, currently, if we shouted racist abuse at someone in the street, there would be action taken. If you shout abuse at a naturist, there is not. And I can't help but think there's quite a clear distinction between shouting abuse at someone for walking around naked or shouting at someone because of their race. And I think that his failure to see that probably isn't great.
And the distinction is that the nudist has chosen to walk around in a way that could be considered unconventional, whereas you can't do anything about your race.
Yeah, I certainly think that's a big part of it. Yeah, and I think that surely naturists know what they're doing is unconventional, and it's unnecessary. As you say, it's clearly a choice.
But it's not designed necessarily to affront people. It is something that they're doing, as we just heard from that lady there, because they deeply feel that that's how they should be, and it's something that we all are. I mean, if that is their philosophical belief, then everyone else wearing clothes is making the strange decision.
But it's not about the intention. You know, you could, with the best will in the world, want to do this because you have body image issues or something, but the result could be incredibly traumatic or triggering or uncomfortable. It's just, and I really struggle with it. I think, as James was saying, I mean, it's taken a really, really long time in this country for things like shouting racist abuse or going after people with disabilities, or, you know, the whole trans thing. It's taken such a long time. Homophobic abuse, it's taken such a long time to make headway on that, and I just can't help, I just don't think this is in the same category. And for me, it very much feels like that sort of, I know that there's a lot of humour around it and all that sort of thing, but it feels like something you do on a special beach on holiday, and like, yeah, good for you, go and do that. But I just do not think this falls into the same category at all.
But would you feel uncomfortable if, I'm trying to think of an example here, you're on a bus, someone gets on with no clothes. I mean, in a sense, you might feel uncomfortable in the first place because that's happened. But then would you feel uncomfortable if someone then started harassing that person and laughing at them because they were wearing no clothes? I would.
Yeah, I think it seems like it's straightforward until you start digging into a question like this. And even what nudity is already quite a controversial topic. You know, topless women are regarded as being naked. Topless men are regarded as not being naked in certain spaces. It's okay to appear in very little clothing, a bikini or whatever, and in other places that's unacceptable. There was a documentary that was done in a short film festival back in Sydney when I lived there years ago that was How Far Can You Wear Your Underpants from the Beach? And this guy just got further and further on different forms of transport and wanted to sort of monitor the reaction of people as he went. And I think that even the association of nudity with shamefulness or deviance is something that's socialized rather than natural. We all do come out naked. And so I can sort of see the point that a naturist might want to make, that they're in their most basic form and we're the ones with the problem.
There's something specifically funny and weird about British naturism, though, I think, James. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is it kind of undercuts the various different social structures that Britain holds on to. And the other is it's really cold here. So it's not like, in Australia, it is probably more expected to, even on the beach, see someone in their pants. In the UK, that if you're even on the hottest day of the year, once you go one row back from the beach, it's going to be too cold to be in that scenario.
I mean, yes, absolutely. I certainly wouldn't want to do it on a very cold day. But I mean, I think that it's interesting, actually, what you just said there about how it kind of cuts away some of those barriers, because that's not something I thought of before. But I suppose it's similar to one of the reasons for wearing a school uniform is that then you can't necessarily tell the background of kids as easily or something. Maybe if we all walked around naked or something, it would cut away kind of barriers on class and things like that, and that could be a good thing.
Be done with Hugo Boss once and for all.
Exactly. But I mean, I guess I think it is a dress code. So the chief of British Naturism, which I think has about 9,000 members, says that he's called it a dress code. He said it's not acceptable to shout at someone on the basis of their sexual preference or race, yet naturists still receive that type of abuse based on their dress code. So on one hand, you've got him saying it's a philosophical belief and they should do it and it's all very deep and meaningful. But then on the other hand, they are saying it is just a dress code, which kind of takes me back to your point about if someone got on the bus wearing something completely outrageous and silly and people started laughing at them, I would feel bad for them because I don't like people to be laughed at in public and feel bad. But
yeah, and I think just on that point, I think Greater Manchester Policing, they have also included goths and emos and punks. If you abuse them specifically for what they're wearing, that's a hate crime specifically in Greater Manchester. So that's similar to in compared to racism or disability, this is something you're actively choosing to present yourself in a certain way, and that's still classed as being a hate crime, I believe.
I wonder as well, to go back to our first story in a way, whether this is partly a story about educating the public as well, a gap between the public understanding of what the law is and what the law is, because you can walk around naked in the UK, right? That is our right. A lot of the abuse that people get is probably predicated on the assumption people are making that they shouldn't be doing that.
You can walk around naked in England and Wales. I think the rules are actually slightly different in Scotland, which is why the guy who always decided to walk from kind of the bottom of the UK to the top always found himself getting arrested in Scotland all the time and then appearing naked in court and just compounding his problems. But yeah, so I think it's legal. You can walk around naked, although there are certain restrictions on your behaviour or what you say that we kind of fall under for everything. So under Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, it says that everyone has the freedom of expression, but there may be restrictions for things like prevention of disorder or crime or protection of health or morals. So you could make the case that, sure, you've got the freedom to express yourself by walking around naked, but if it outrages people's morality, then perhaps it is a problem. You've also got things like Section 4 of the Public Order Act, which make it an offence for someone to cause alarm or distress, and clearly if you're walking around naked you could cause some people alarm or distress.
And actually it seems to me the interpretation of that is often down basically to the proximity of your genitals to other people, and that actually might not be your fault. You might go out for a ramble and then end up in a queue at the post office.
I thought there was an amusing thing Arion mentioned earlier, that there's definitely a difference in gender, and what's considered full nudity or partial nudity depends on kind of whether you're a man or a woman. So if you're a woman with her top off, that's considered partially nude. If you're a bloke in a part doing the same, it's not considered partially nude. And I saw a thing that Instagram had banned female nipples, and if you look at their guidance, it specifically says female nipples are banned from the website. So in 2015, this campaign was launched which saw users Photoshop male nipples over female nipples.
And also the breastfeeding was a big thing, wasn't it? Yeah. Because pictures, I remember, was that last year that went crazy with people getting censored or their images taken down if they were breastfeeding? There was a big sort of counter campaign against that. It does definitely seem like there's double standards when it comes to nudity between the sexes.
Okay, but we're all being very kind of like, case by case basis, da-da-da. The Crown Prosecution Service guidance currently says a balance needs to be struck between the naturist's right to freedom of expression and the right of the wider public to be protected from harassment, alarm and distress. That's sort of saying what we're saying. So that is the law as it is. So therefore, do the British naturists have a point? Are they going to successfully campaign to get this law changed for it to be a hate crime to abuse them?
The Law Commission has weighed in on this and said that they confirmed that they'd received the comments from British Naturism as an organisation, and they were going to take that ahead with official consultation, which is going to be launched next spring. Almost from the phraseology of that statement, it sounds to me as though it could result in kind of what we're suggesting, that the issue will be considered and then possibly shelved or dismissed. So it seems like
why then does this have implications for all our futures, James?
Well,
your story of the week.
It absolutely has implications for all our futures, because I think that people listening to this might think about becoming a nudist or a naturist for the first time in their lives and go out and do it. And that would actually be a really... No, I haven't got an argument there.
Have any of you ever, gone free?
I have gone free. I went to a German sauna in an East German city, and the done thing there is to be completely naked.
Yes.
So I kind of wandered into my swimming trunks. They had to go immediately. I was thinking, okay, fine. I'd say for the first 10 seconds I was appalled. Then I started having the time of my life. It was great wandering around. I felt very free. I would say it was a broadly positive experience.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of Swedish weddings and same deal. Like at some stage of proceedings...
In the sauna though, right?
Or in the lake, whatever. Swedes just just throw their clothes off and...
But not in the church.
Good point. And get naked after the actual marrying bit is done. And they're very sort of free about it, and it is quite liberating.
We've all been wandering through the rural parts of a lovely English county and gone skinny dipping in the river at some point, and that's all harmless fun, isn't it? Which makes me think there is a big difference between doing this in rural environments and urban environments. If you do this wandering around Shropshire, it's probably fine. If you do this wandering through, down Oxford Street, you're a pervert.
As goes for so many things. Well, shout out to British Naturism and all their members. No, they have their knockers, but that is it for another edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to James, Arion and Felicity. You can expose yourself to our back catalogue when you subscribe to this podcast feed. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann, Clothed. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Matt Hill at Rethink Audio, status unknown. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.